Imagine a small town built on 7 muddy hills beside a river. No walls worth the name, no army worth fearing. A few thousand farmers, shepherds and exiles, surrounded on every side by older, richer, stronger neighbours who would happily wipe them off the map. That town should have died young. It should be a footnote, a name no one remembers. One more little swallowed by history, the way thousands of others were swallowed and forgotten. Instead, that town became the centre of the world. It built roads you can still walk on today. It wrote laws that still shape the courts you would stand in. It spread a language that became the mother of half the words in your mouth right now. For 1,000 years, the word for power, anywhere from Britain to the deserts of the East, was a single word: Rome. So, how did it happen? How does a muddy village on a river beat the entire known world and hold it for centuries? It did not happen by accident, and it did not happen all at once. It happened in moments, specific, knife-edge moments where everything could have gone the other way. Moments where Rome stood one step from extinction and chose instead to become unstoppable. Tonight, we are going to walk through 10 of those moments. 10 turning points that took a town of farmers and turned it into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And then we are going to look at the one moment that finally brought it all crashing down. So get comfortable, settle in, let the world you know fade away, because we are going back more than 2,500 years, to the very beginning when Rome was ruled by kings, and the first great moment was about to arrive. In the beginning, Rome had kings. 7 of them, the stories say, stretching back to its mythical founding. Some were wise, some built temples and walls, and the last of them was a tyrant. His name was Tarquin. The Romans remembered him as Tarquin the Proud, and proud is a kind word for what he was. He ruled through fear. He executed men who crossed him. He ignored the council of elders, the Senate, and did exactly as he pleased. And then his family went one step too far. The details are old and tangled in legend, but the heart of the story is this. A member of the royal family committed a terrible crime against a noble woman of the city, a woman named Lucretia. The shame and the outrage of it broke something open in Rome. The people had had enough. Led by a man named Brutus, the Romans rose up and drove the king out. They threw the whole royal family beyond the walls and slammed the gates behind them. But here is the moment that truly mattered. It was not just that they removed one bad king, it was what they did next. They swore an oath, a public, sacred, unbreakable oath. Never again would one man rule Rome. Never again would they kneel to a king. In place of the king, they built something new. They created 2 leaders, instead of one, called consuls, who would share power and watch each other like hawks. And these consuls would rule for 1 year only, 1 single year, and then they had to step down and let others take their place. Think about how radical that was. In a world of god-kings and pharaohs and emperors who ruled until death, Rome built a system designed to stop any single person from ever becoming too powerful. They called it the Republic, the public thing, the property of the people, not of a king. And this is the foundation of everything that follows. Because a kingdom rises and falls with one man. A good king builds, a bad king destroys, and when he dies, it can all come undone. But the Republic was a machine. It did not depend on any one person. Leaders came and went, year after year, while the system rolled on, gathering strength. Rome had just invented a way to survive its own leaders, and that machine was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable, because not far to the north a storm was gathering. A storm with swords. It is roughly 80 years later, and Rome is still small, still finding its feet, still squabbling with its neighbours over fields and cattle and pride. And then, out of the north, came a people the Romans barely understood, tall warriors with long swords and wild hair who fought with a fury Rome had never seen. The Romans called them the Gauls. A Roman army marched out to stop them at a little river called the Allia. It was a slaughter. The Roman line broke almost at once. The soldiers panicked and ran. Some drowned trying to cross the river in their armour. The rest scattered into the hills. The road to Rome lay wide open, and there was nothing left to defend it. The Gauls walked into the city. Imagine that. Imagine watching from a hilltop as smoke rises over your home, as a foreign army strolls through your streets, burning, looting, smashing. Almost the entire city went up in flames. Centuries of records and treasures, gone. A handful of defenders held out on the steepest hill, half-starved, surrounded. The story says the enemy tried to sneak up the cliffs by night, and only the cackling of the sacred geese woke the guards in time to throw them back. This was Rome's lowest point, the city in ashes, the people humiliated. The Gauls only left after Rome paid them a fortune in gold to go away. And when they weighed out that gold, the enemy, chieftain, is said to have thrown his own heavy sword onto the scales. So the Romans had to pay even more. Woe to the vanquished, he sneered. Woe to the conquered. Most cities never recover from a blow like that. Many simply disappear. But here is the moment. Here is what made Rome different. Some Romans wanted to give up on the ruined city entirely and move somewhere else. And Rome refused. They stayed. They rebuilt, stone by stone, on the same scorched ground. And then they did something that revealed the true Roman character for the first time. They got angry, and they got organized. They built proper walls. They reformed their army, and they swore that never again would Rome be caught so weak. Over the next decades, they did not just defend themselves. They went out and conquered every neighbor who had ever threatened them. The disaster did not break Rome. It hardened it. It taught Rome a lesson it would carry for the next 1,000 years. Rome could lose a battle. Rome could lose a city. Rome could be brought to its knees, and Rome would still, always, get back up. That refusal to ever stay down was about to face its greatest test of all, against a man whose name still echoes as one of the deadliest enemies Rome ever faced. By now, Rome controlled Italy. It had grown strong, confident, a rising power in the Western Mediterranean, and that brought it face to face with the one rival big enough to destroy it, Carthage. Carthage was a great trading empire across the sea in what is now Tunisia, rich, powerful, with a navy that ruled the waves. And Carthage produced one of the greatest military minds in all of human history. His name was Hannibal. Hannibal hated Rome with his whole heart, and he had a plan so bold it sounds insane even now. Instead of attacking by sea, he marched an entire army, including war elephants, up through Spain, across southern France, and over the frozen, deadly peaks of the Alps to strike Italy from the north, where Rome least expected it. He lost thousands of men and most of his elephants in the mountains, and he still arrived in Italy strong enough to crush every army Rome sent against him. And then came the day, the worst day in Roman history, a place called Cannae. Rome was so desperate to stop Hannibal that it gathered the largest army it had ever fielded, tens of thousands of men. They outnumbered Hannibal nearly 2 to 1. They were sure, this time, they would simply overwhelm him. Hannibal let them think that. He arranged his line so that the center seemed weak. The Romans pushed into it, pressing forward, smelling victory, packing tighter and tighter as they advanced. And that was the trap. Hannibal's centre bent backward like a bow, drawing them in, while his cavalry destroyed the Roman horsemen and swung around behind. And then the jaws closed. The Romans were surrounded on every side, packed so tightly that many could not even raise their weapons. And there, in a single afternoon, Hannibal butchered them. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers died in a few hours. It remains one of the deadliest single days of battle in all of history. To grasp the scale of it, think of this. So many Roman noblemen fell that day that Hannibal's men collected a small mountain of gold rings from the bodies of the dead, rings that only the highest class of Romans were allowed to wear. They poured those rings out by the bucketful to show the leaders of Carthage just how complete the slaughter had been. When the news reached Rome, the city went silent with horror. An entire generation of young men gone. The enemy was loose in Italy. By every rule of war, Rome was finished. It should have surrendered. Any sane state would have surrendered. And here is the moment that defined Rome forever. Rome refused. The Senate would not even allow the word peace to be spoken. They did not ransom the prisoners. They armed slaves. They rebuilt the army from boys and old men. When one of the defeated commanders came home, they did not punish him for surviving. They thanked him because he had not despaired of the Republic. Rome simply would not accept that it had lost, and slowly, painfully, it turned the war around. A Roman general named Scipio took the fight to Carthage's own homeland, and years later, on African soil at a place called Zama, Rome finally defeated the great Hannibal himself. The lesson of Cannae rang out across the ancient world. You could beat a Roman army. You could kill Romans by the tens of thousands. You could do everything right. And it would not be enough, because Rome would never, ever quit. Surviving Hannibal changed Rome. Before the war with Carthage, Rome was a regional power, the master of Italy. After it, Rome had a new and dangerous idea about itself, that it should rule everything. But there was still Carthage. Beaten, yes. Humbled, yes. But still standing, still trading, still slowly growing rich again across the sea. And Rome could not stop thinking about it. There was a famous old senator named Cato. The stories say that no matter what the Senate was debating, no matter the subject, he would end every single speech with the same words. Carthage must be destroyed. A debate about roads. And furthermore, Carthage must be destroyed. A debate about grain. And furthermore, Carthage must be destroyed. Over and over, until the words sank into the bones of the Roman state. And eventually, Rome found its excuse for war. The Roman army crossed the sea and laid siege to the city of Carthage itself. The siege lasted 3 terrible years. The people of Carthage fought with the desperation of those who know they are fighting for their very existence. They turned their temples into workshops, the women cutting their hair to make ropes for the war machines. It did not matter. In the end, Rome broke into the city, and what followed was not just a battle, it was an erasure. The Romans fought street by street, house by house, for days. When it was over, the survivors were sold into slavery, and the great city of Carthage, one of the wonders of the ancient world, was burned to the ground. That same year, far to the east, Rome destroyed another great city, Corinth in Greece, to make the same point to a different part of the world. The message was the same in both directions. Rome was no longer one power among many. Rome was the power. The entire Mediterranean Sea, that vast highway of trade and war, was now effectively a Roman lake. They would soon call it, with breathtaking arrogance, our sea. But here is the strange thing about this moment. This was the height of Rome's success, and it planted the seed of a deadly problem. all that conquest brought a flood of money and slaves into Rome. The rich grew unimaginably rich. The poor, the very farmers whose sons had died winning these wars, came home to find their small farms swallowed up by the wealthy. Rome had defeated every enemy outside its walls. Now, slowly, it would begin to turn its swords on itself, and the man who would change the Roman army forever was about to step onto the stage. Up to this point, the Roman army was an army of citizens. To be a soldier, you had to own property. You had to be a landholder, because soldiers had to buy their own weapons and armor. The idea was simple. Men who owned a piece of Rome would fight hardest to protect it. But there was a problem, and it was getting worse every year. All those wars of conquest had ruined the small farmers. Fewer and fewer men owned enough land to qualify as soldiers. Rome was running out of the very citizens it needed to fill its legions, just as its empire was growing larger and harder to defend. Enter a tough, brilliant, ambitious general named Marius. Marius looked at this problem and made a decision that would reshape Roman history. He threw out the old rule. He opened the army to everyone, including the poorest citizens, the men who owned nothing at all. The state would now arm them. The state would train them. And in return, these men would serve for many years as full-time professional soldiers. This sounds like a simple administrative change. It was an earthquake, because for the first time, Rome had a true professional army. Not farmers who fought for a season and went home, but hardened, lifelong soldiers who drilled constantly and could march for days under enormous loads of equipment. They carried so much gear that men nicknamed them Marius's mules. These legions became the most fearsome fighting machine the world had ever seen. Disciplined, relentless, able to build a fortified camp every single night, no matter where they were, able to march and march and march and then win. But this reform carried a hidden danger, a poison in the cup. The old citizen soldiers had been loyal to Rome. These new professional soldiers, the poor men with nothing, became loyal to something else. They became loyal to the general who paid them, who fed them, and who promised them land when they retired. Do you see the danger? For the first time, a Roman general could command an army that was loyal to him personally, more than to the Senate or the Republic. Marius had built the perfect war machine, and in doing so, he had handed ambitious men a weapon they could one day turn against Rome itself. It would not take long for someone to pick that weapon up. And his name is the most famous name in all of Roman history, Julius Caesar. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, you know the name. It became a word for ruler itself. The German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar both come straight from Caesar. But before he was a legend, he was a politician. Brilliant, charming, deeply in debt, and almost frighteningly ambitious. To win the glory and the money he needed, Caesar took command of an army and marched north into Gaul, the vast, fierce land that is now France and Belgium. Over 8 long years, he conquered all of it. He fought hundreds of battles. He invaded Britain. He defeated enemy armies, many times the size of his own. His greatest test came against a Gallic chieftain named Vercingetorix, who united the tribes in one last desperate stand. Caesar trapped his enemy inside a hilltop fortress, and then did something almost unbelievable. He built a wall of wood and earth all the way around the fortress to keep the enemy in. And then, when he learned a huge relief army was coming, he built a second wall facing outward to keep that army out. His soldiers fought, surrounded on both sides, and they won. When it was over, the proud Gallic leader rode out, laid his weapons at Caesar's feet, and surrendered. By the end of those years in Gaul, perhaps 1 million people had died, and another million had been sold into slavery. It was a conquest of staggering brutality, and it made Caesar the richest, most powerful, most feared man in the Roman world. By the end, Caesar was the most successful general alive, with the most loyal, battle-hardened army in the Roman world. Exactly the kind of army that Marius had made possible. An army that loved Caesar more than it loved Rome, and that terrified his enemies back in the city. The Senate saw what was coming. They saw a man too powerful, too popular, too dangerous to the Republic. So they gave him an order. Lay down your command, send your soldiers home. Return to Rome alone as a private citizen. If he obeyed, he would be at the mercy of his enemies, who would likely destroy him. If he disobeyed and brought his army home, it was treason. It was civil war. And so we come to one of the most famous moments in all of history. A small river in northern Italy called the Rubicon. By sacred Roman law, no general was allowed to bring an army across that river toward Rome. To cross it under arms was to declare war on the Republic itself. Caesar stood on the bank with his soldiers, and he thought. The stories say he hesitated. He knew that whatever he chose, there was no going back. On one side of the water lay safety and the law. On the other lay treason, war, and a gamble for everything. And then he gave the order to cross. The die is cast, he is said to have murmured. The dice have been thrown. There is no taking them back. That single step into the water was a step into a new world. Caesar marched on Rome. His enemies fled before him. He fought and won a great civil war across 3 continents, and he made himself master of the entire Roman state, taking the title of dictator, this time not for a year, but for life. The Republic, that proud machine built 500 years before to make sure no single man could ever rule Rome, was effectively dead. But Caesar would not enjoy his victory for long. A group of senators, terrified that he had become a king in all but name, gathered around him on a day in March, and there, on the floor of the Senate, they drew their hidden daggers and stabbed him to death. He fell at the foot of a statue of his old rival. They killed Caesar to save the Republic. But it was already too late. They had not saved the Republic. They had simply opened the door for someone else to finish what Caesar started, and that someone would build something that lasted 500 years. When Caesar was murdered, Rome fell into chaos and another round of brutal civil wars. Out of that bloodshed, one man rose above all the others. He was Caesar's adopted son and heir, a young man, often sick, not much of a soldier himself, and yet the most patient and cunning politician Rome ever produced. His name was Octavian, and history would come to know him as Augustus. Augustus learned the lesson of his murdered father perfectly. Caesar had been killed because he looked too much like a king. He had grabbed power too openly, worn it too proudly, and frightened too many people. So Augustus did something far cleverer. He took absolute power, but he wrapped it in the old, familiar clothes of the Republic. He never called himself king. He never called himself dictator. He called himself first citizen, just a humble servant of the state. He let the Senate keep meeting. He kept the old titles and the old ceremonies alive. It was a beautiful illusion. On the surface, the Republic still stood. Underneath, one man now held all the real power: the army, the treasury, the provinces. All of it answered to Augustus. This was the true birth of the Roman Empire, and Augustus became, in everything but name, its first emperor. But here is why this moment matters so much. It was not just a clever power grab. It worked. After 100 years of civil wars and chaos and bloodshed, Augustus gave the Roman world something it had not had in generations: peace. Historians call it the Roman peace. For roughly 200 years, the vast Roman world, stretching across 3 continents and ruling tens of millions of people, lived in relative stability and safety. Think about what that meant for an ordinary person. You could travel from the north of England all the way to Egypt, thousands of miles, using a single currency, speaking a common language, protected by a single law and a single army, on roads that were safer than they had been for centuries. Trade exploded, cities grew, great monuments rose. Augustus famously boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, and he ruled for a very long time, more than 40 years, long enough that almost everyone alive had never known a world without him. By the time he died, an old man in his bed, the chaos of the civil wars had faded into memory, and the rule of one man seemed not like a tragedy, but like a blessing. The people had traded their old freedom for peace and safety, and most of them never wanted to trade back. This was Rome at its most confident. The wars of survival were over. The Republic's chaos was over. In its place stood a stable empire, rich and proud and seemingly eternal. It is easy, looking at this golden age, to think Rome's power came only from its armies. But the deepest reason Rome lasted so long was not the sword. It was something far quieter and far more lasting, something you still live inside of today. Here is a question. Why did Rome last for centuries when so many other empires rose fast and collapsed just as quickly? The answer is not really the legions. Plenty of empires had fearsome armies and still fell apart in a generation. The real secret of Rome was that it knew how to hold what it conquered, and it did that with 2 things that had nothing to do with the battlefield: roads and law. Let us start with the roads. The Romans built roads like no one before them. Not muddy tracks, but proper, engineered highways, with deep foundations of stone and gravel, slightly raised in the middle, so the rain ran off, paved on top, and built as straight as the land would allow. They built tens of thousands of miles of these roads, knitting the entire empire together. And those roads did something profound. They meant that a legion could march to any trouble spot in days instead of weeks. They meant that messages, trade, and food could flow across continents. They meant that a distant frontier town felt connected to the heart of Rome. There is an old saying, all roads lead to Rome, and for 1,000 years it was almost literally true. Some of those roads are still in use as the foundations of routes you can drive today, and alongside the roads came the aqueducts, those soaring stone arches that carried fresh water dozens of miles into the cities, feeding fountains and baths and homes with an engineering skill that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years after Rome fell. But the roads and the aqueducts, as astonishing as they are not even the most important thing Rome left behind. That would be the law. The Romans were obsessed with law. They wrote it down. They debated it. They built an entire system of rules about property, contracts, rights, and justice. They developed ideas we still take for granted, like the principle that a person should be considered innocent until proven guilty, and that even the powerful should, in theory, answer to the law. And when Rome conquered a new people, it did not just rule them at sword point. Over time, it offered them something extraordinary. It offered them a path to becoming Roman themselves. Roman law, Roman citizenship, a stake in the system. That is the real secret. Rome did not only conquer bodies. It conquered loyalties. It made the conquered want to be Roman. Roman law became the foundation for the legal systems of much of the world. Look closely at the courts and constitutions of dozens of modern nations, and you will find Roman fingerprints all over them. So, when you imagine Rome's power, do not just picture soldiers. Picture a straight stone road vanishing over the horizon. Picture water flowing across a valley on great stone arches. Picture a courtroom where a man can argue he is innocent. That is the machine that made Rome unstoppable, and it was about to reach the absolute peak of its power, stretching further than any European empire would for over 1,000 years. Every empire has a single high water mark, a moment when it stretches as far as it ever will before the long tide begins to turn. For Rome, that moment came under an emperor named Trajan. Trajan was a soldier's emperor. Tough, energetic, respected, the kind of leader who shared hardship with his men. And under his rule, in the early 2nd century after Christ, the Roman Empire reached its greatest size in all its history. Try to picture the sheer scale of it. In the west, Rome ruled all of Spain, all of Gaul, and the island of Britain, with soldiers standing guard on a great wall in the cold north of England. In the south, it ruled the entire coast of North Africa and the rich kingdom of Egypt, the breadbasket that fed the city of Rome itself. In the east, its power reached into the Middle East, all the way toward the Persian Gulf. And around the heart of it all lay the entire Mediterranean Sea, a Roman lake from end to end. Tens of millions of people, from countless different cultures and languages, all living under one Roman government. An empire so large it would take a determined traveller months to cross from one end to the other. And here is the truly remarkable part. It mostly worked. A merchant in Britain and a merchant in Syria used the same coins. A soldier from Spain might spend his career on the banks of a distant northern river. Ideas, goods, and people flowed across an enormous, connected world, held together by those roads, that law, and the long shadow of the legions. This was the dream of Rome made real. A single, vast, civilized world, at peace within its borders, defended at its edges, and ruled from one great city. Standing at this peak, you might have believed it would last forever. The Romans certainly did. They had a phrase for their city, the eternal city. But no empire, however great, can only expand forever. The borders were now so long that defending them swallowed enormous resources. Beyond those borders waited countless peoples who envied Rome's wealth and watched its frontiers with hungry eyes. The tide had reached its highest point, and from here, slowly at first, almost invisibly, it would begin to go out. Our 10th and final moment of Roman greatness is a quiet one. No great battle, no burning city, just a single decree signed by an emperor named Caracalla. For most of its history, Roman citizenship had been a precious, guarded thing. To be a Roman citizen meant rights, protection under Roman law, status. Many of the millions of people living inside the empire were not full citizens at all. They were subjects, taxed and ruled, but without the full privileges of being Roman. Then Caracalla signed his decree. In one stroke, he granted Roman citizenship to almost every free person in the entire empire. Overnight, millions of people, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of the north, from Greek scholars to Egyptian farmers, all became, in the eyes of the law, fully Roman. Now historians argue about why he did it. Some say it was a noble vision of unity. Others, more cynical, point out that citizens paid certain taxes that non-citizens did not, so a sudden flood of new citizens meant a sudden flood of new tax money for an emperor who badly needed it. The reason almost does not matter. The result was extraordinary. Think of what this represented. An empire, built by conquest, by the sword, by crushing its enemies, had reached a point where it declared that nearly everyone within its borders was now equally Roman. Your ancestors could have fought against Rome. Your homeland could have been conquered generations before. It no longer mattered. This was the final fulfillment of that ancient secret we spoke about. Rome did not just conquer lands, it absorbed peoples. It dissolved the line between conqueror and conquered until, in the end, almost everyone was on the inside. No empire before had ever done anything quite like it on such a scale. And in a strange way, this moment marks the very summit of the Roman idea. The dream of a single, shared, civilized world had become, on paper at least, complete. Everyone was Roman, but even as Caracalla signed that decree, the foundations beneath the empire were beginning to crack. The borders were too long. The cost of the armies was crushing. Emperors were beginning to be made and unmade by their own soldiers, sometimes lasting only months before being murdered and replaced. The unstoppable machine was, very slowly, starting to grind. And out beyond the frontiers, the pressure was building toward one terrible moment. The moment when everything Rome had built for 1,000 years would finally come apart. So we come to the last moment. Not a moment of glory, but of collapse. For all its strength, the Roman Empire was never truly destroyed by a single enemy in a single great battle. Its fall was slower, and in some ways sadder than that. But there is one moment where you can watch the beginning of the end with terrible clarity. It comes at a place called Adrianople. By this time, the empire had been struggling for generations. To the north, beyond the rivers that marked Rome's frontier, lived many peoples the Romans lumped together as barbarians. Among them were the Goths. And the Goths were running for their lives because behind them came a terror out of the east. Fierce mounted warriors known as the Huns. The Goths came to the Roman border not as invaders, but as refugees. They begged to be let in, to settle safely on Roman land in exchange for service. And Rome, at first, agreed. But then Roman officials treated these desperate refugees with such cruelty and corruption, cheating them, starving them, even selling their children, that the Goths rose up in fury. The Eastern Emperor, a man named Valens, marched out to crush them. He was overconfident. He did not wait for reinforcements. And at Adrianople, the Goths and their cavalry shattered his army. The Emperor of Rome himself was killed on the field, his body never even recovered. It was a catastrophe to rank with Cannae all those centuries before. But there was a terrible difference. After Cannae, Rome had been young and hungry and unbreakable. It had refused to surrender and clawed its way back to victory. After Adrianople, Rome was old and tired and stretched too thin. This time, it could not simply rebuild and conquer its way out. This time, the barbarians were inside the borders for good, and they were never going to leave. From here, the slide accelerated. The empire had already split into two halves, east and west, simply because it had grown too vast for one man to rule. The wealthier eastern half, centered on the city of Constantinople, would survive for another 1,000 years. But the western half, the half that contained the city of Rome itself, was dying. Then the unthinkable happened. A Gothic army, led by a king named Alaric, marched on the city of Rome and sacked it. For the first time in 800 years, since those Gauls all those centuries ago, a foreign enemy plundered the eternal city. When the news reached the wider world, people could not believe it. If Rome could fall, they wrote, what was safe, and still the bleeding continued. Province after province slipped from Roman control. The great machine of roads and law and legions broke down piece by piece. Tax money dried up, armies went unpaid, the frontier dissolved, until at last we reached the final year. In that year, the last Roman emperor in the West sat on the throne. He was a boy, little more than a child, and by a strange twist of history, his name combined the name of Rome's mythical founder and Rome's first emperor. He was called Romulus Augustulus. and a Germanic commander named Odoacer simply pushed him aside. There was no great final battle, no heroic last stand. The boy emperor was quietly removed and sent away to live out his days on a pension. Odoacer did not even bother to claim the title of Emperor of the West. He simply sent the imperial robes back east and ruled Italy as a king. And with that quiet, almost bureaucratic moment, the Western Roman Empire, the thing that had begun as a muddy village on 7 hills more than 1,000 years before, came to an end. There was no scream, no thunderclap, just an old, exhausted giant finally lying down. The roads remained, the aqueducts remained, the law remained, scattered like seeds across the lands Rome had touched. But the empire itself, in the west, was gone. So there they are, 10 moments that took a town of farmers and made it the master of the world, and the one long, sad moment that brought the Western Empire to its end. But here is the strange and beautiful truth about Rome. It never really died. Walk through almost any city in Europe and you will find its bones. The straight roads beneath modern streets. The Latin words carved over old doorways. The arches and the columns echoed in courthouses and banks and palaces built more than 1,000 years after Rome fell. Open a law book in dozens of countries, and you are reading the distant descendants of Roman law. Speak Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, or Romanian, and you are speaking the living children of Latin, the language of Rome. Even in English, more than half the words you use every day can be traced back, through long and winding roads, to Rome. The calendar on your wall, with its months named for Roman gods and Roman emperors. The way we count, the way we build, the way we argue in court, the very idea that the people, and not a king, should be the source of power. All of it carries the fingerprints of Rome. That is the thing about this story. We talk about the fall of Rome as if it were the end, but an empire that shapes the world this deeply does not really fall. It simply soaks into everything that comes after it, until you can no longer see where it ends and the modern world begins. So the next time you walk down a long, straight road, the next time you hear someone called a Caesar or a senator, the next time you stand in a courtroom and hear the words innocent until proven guilty, remember the muddy village on the 7 hills. Remember the 10 moments that made it unstoppable, and the one that finally brought it down. And remember that, in a strange and wonderful way, a piece of Rome is still alive, in our cities, in our laws, in our words, and in you. If you enjoyed walking through history with me tonight, stay a little longer. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, more lost worlds to step into, more nights to drift away into the past. Rest well, and let the long story of Rome carry you gently into sleep.